So in terms of presentation, I'll just go through briefly present you on the NDA, its role, and how the NDA links with the Ministry of Finance. Then I'll talk about the strengthening component, and the main discussion I think would be on challenges, and I'll move to that. You all know this structure. This is basically a GCF architecture of what the NDA, who the NDA are, or what their function is. And in case of Nepal, as Arabi, a similar case in Ghana, it's also the Ministry of Finance for Nepal. And the person in charge under the Ministry of Finance, you have 5 divisions, and the leading division that looks after this as a contact point is the International Economic Cooperation Coordination Division. So it basically looks into the international affairs, fund management aspect of it. So it's part of its portfolio that is a broader picture. And so if you look at their portfolio of how it kind of relates to the GCF's mandate, it's very similar to, or it's very in line with what the International Economic Coordination Cooperation Division does. If you look at the functions, if you have 3 core functions, there's donor coordination, they have to look at sector coordination and aid management. So this portfolio is very much in line with what the GCF is seeking, each of the NDA kind of fulfills. I'm not going into detail of this. So this, in part, as Arabi mentioned earlier, in Nepal, the UNFCCC focal point is the Ministry of Environment. They were also approached to take over as the NDA, but I think they, in a way, they declined. But then this was taken over by the Ministry of Finance, and they were formally nominated in January 2016. And so if you look at their portfolio, it's very in kind of a match between what GCF is looking for. But Ministry of Finance is not a technical ministry in terms of climate change. It does not do anything on climate change. What it does, it kind of facilitates. It kind of strengthens, leverages country kind of stakeholder into financing. The ministries, the sectoral ministries needs to get an approval from the Ministry of Finance to get any sort of funding to Nepal. So based on this technical, the lack of technical, there was a need for a kind of a process to identify what the GCF is seeking from that NDA or that country as such, to what function or what the Ministry of Finance can do as a NDA for that, or how the NDA can fulfill that mandate. So what we exercised was, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we had the opportunity to review the operational manual that Ghana had prepared, and based on this, one of the first modality or first implementation that we took is we wanted to do a capacity assessment of the NDA. Because as I mentioned earlier, this is not their portfolio. This is not something, the NDA is not, it's not part of their function. They're not required to, they're not obligated to kind of, as a part of the daily work to kind of function as an NDA. But having this mandate, they're required to kind of fulfill this and ensure that once they're nominated as NDA, they're required to kind of fill the check boxes. So one of the exercises was to see how they kind of, what are the gaps? What are the capacity gaps? What are the gaps between what's the technical understanding of GCF within the NDA? How can they function as an NDA? How can they kind of meet or fulfill the requirements of the 5 kind of check boxes that GCF has as a scope of the NDA? So you're looking at their capacity, their technical aspect, their structure, whether they can fulfill it, or how can we make them efficient as an institution so that they're able to kind of fulfill these roles. So based on this, we had a capacity need assessment as a first task of kind of institutional capacity building. Under these, we basically had senior officials from the Ministry of Finance, including the division and as well as the budget division, who were responsible for budgeting. They were involved in this process to kind of come up with, it was more kind of structured as an orientation, as well as kind of underlining like how do they identify the gaps within that institution if they're supposed to function as an NDA. So based on this, the output of the entire exercise that was the government part stakeholders, they identified that we need a structure. We need a structure within the Ministry of Finance if we're supposed to fulfill this task. We need to have a structure that gives us the authority to kind of make policy decisions. We need a structure to have a body or within that institution to kind of review those applications or GCF processes. We need an institution to kind of do a day-to-day work of the GCF, but not only GCF, but also broader climate finance. Because if you look at Nepal's portfolio, we have the CIF from the World Bank, we have other such climate finances, adaptation fund, that are coming into the country, which the Ministry of Finance oversees. So this is the structure that was identified first. And the second is mapping the capacity gaps. As I mentioned earlier, this is not a climate change technical ministry. It's about budgeting. They know numbers, they know figures, they know the amounts. So they are this kind of institution. They're not familiar to what climate change, what climate finance is. And they're also not, in terms of operation structure, they're not familiar to this. And then third is that they need a sort of a guidance of procedures to kind of help them in terms of, if you look at transitions within the government, especially in Nepal, also I guess in Ghana as well, the government officials are there for 2 years. And then beyond 2 years, they're either transferred. So this happens. So you need something of a guidance and procedures that needs to be created and that needs to be institutionalized within the country. So this was the three kind of outputs that came out of the workshop. And for us, for the readiness program, to build on our next phase, moving ahead with the institutional component. So what we did was, if you look at the exercise that we did was, we looked at two approaches which we moved ahead with. One is in terms of a system, and then the other one is a process. So system in terms of having kind of a structure within the NDA to function, as I mentioned earlier, in basically 3 tiers. One, you're looking at a setup within the institution to kind of do a day-to-day climate finance GCF related activities. What I mean by this is, so what the NDA ended up doing was it basically set up a climate finance unit. The climate finance unit was headed by the undersecretary of that division, who had 2 support officers. And they basically, any proposals that related to GCF, that was forwarded to the desk. They reviewed it, and they were responded to any queries by GCF. And he was responsible for overseeing most of the day-to-day activities. Then you need, a second tier was formed, which we termed it as a technical committee. The technical committee was more in line with providing technical guidance to the NDA. So technical guidance in terms of when we have proposals, GCF proposal, we have, if you look at the past 2 years, the Nepal NDA has received about, 10 proposals. And these 10 proposals have been reviewed by the climate finance unit. They've been as a day-to-day operation or communication, and they've been reviewed by the technical committee. So the technical committee is more of an interministerial committee that has representatives of key ministries and also additional technical expert as per requirement. They also include stakeholders from the women's group, the indigenous group. So it's more of a multidisciplinary kind of technical committee. And then the third tier, or the senior tier, is the more of a steering committee. The steering committee is not to make any decisions on the overall broadly GCF-related issues, but it was more to give the NDA on a policy level guidance of how, in terms of climate finance, and not just specifically to technical committee, not specifically to GCF. So the technical committee, so if you look at the steering committee, this was chaired by the administrative head, which is the secretary of the ministry. The climate finance technical unit is chaired by the joint secretary or the contact point for the NDA. The climate finance unit is chaired by the undersecretary of that division, who is basically responsible to the joint secretary. So it's a kind of complicated structure, but what we expected is, once we had the structure, it was more easier for someone to do the day-to-day communication on GCF-related proposals or accreditations. You had a technical committee that provides guidance or support of decision-making for the NDA, especially on proposals and accreditations. And then you have a steering committee which looks at the broader picture. So this was a structure that was established. Besides those, I think we also looked at processes. Processes meaning you want seemingly, GCF has its own kind of a cycle of process of accreditation, proposal submission. But I think what we went further ahead was, we need to have this process in Nepal itself as a national framework, so that whoever is applying for funding applies the funding in line with what the national structure is, and not just based on what GCF is required, and not just come to NDA and say, okay, give me a no obligation letter, I just need now. So what the framework does is it provides you overall guidance of how you develop a proposal in the country. Who do you engage? What are the stakeholders? What's the process? What's the timeline? So in this process, the framework, it provides the NDA a sort of not only a guidance of steps to what next, but if there's a transition within the government, whoever comes in is always familiar with this process of what's the process of application for proposal for Nepal. So we had the framework for accreditation. You have a framework for proposal development, and also knowledge products were developed. Knowledge products, meaning in terms of, for instance, for Nepal had, Jimmy, can you hold up the book? Sorry, thank you. So we had this toolkit, handbook that was published as a kind of a knowledge product, which provides a kind of a broader, to help broader understanding of the GCF processes in Nepal. So we had, I brought a couple, but I think, I don't know, there will be, probably UNDP wants few, and then UNEP probably give a few. So this was the entirety process as such for the institutional component for Nepal. And if you look along the timeline of the milestones that we've achieved, it started off with the orientation, the capacity engagement, and then we've moved on to when we came to in 2018, we were able to publish the document saying that when we closed the project, we had this guidance document that the NDA needs to kind of stick by and ensure that it's more easier for them, it's more, and they don't take it as an additional burden for them, besides the core of activities, set of activities that they need to implement. Beyond this, I think there are several events that happened from 2016 to the end of 2018. As Arabi said, I think some of the institutional capacity building, once you had this structure in place, you had the mechanisms in place, you had the governance structure in place, each structure requires a separate kind of training. For instance, the technical committee requires a training on how you evaluate proposals. What are the indicators for proposal? What are required for the feasibility assessment? How do you do the economic evaluation? So these trainings are very specific for the technical committee. And so what we're able to do, if you look at the training that we did in December 2017, focuses on these processes of evaluating proposals, what are GCF is seeking in terms of in all those proposals, to kind of give them a support so that they kind of support the NDA in any decisions on proposals. So for if you look at the climate finance unit, we've had the similar training was organized, and additionally, you had other events. For instance, the unlocking for the event in COP last year. Right, this was a steering meeting where the NDA was there to kind of share its discussion, and this is helpful. When we first started this readiness, Nepal participated in the COP22. So this, the undersecretary was fairly new. He had just joined, and he had absolutely no idea of climate change issues, and he was not aware of climate finance. So when he came back from COP, the attitude of how we implement these activities, he was kind of giving us instruction how we need to do it. So it kind of adds value that it's not just international, these international visits, these interactions with GCF, it kind of supports the NDA in terms of their own capacity building. Since, for instance, we had gone to Bali for the GCF regional dialogue in April 2017. And then after meeting a couple of national entities, it just clicked to him. He said, like, we already had done accreditation we're supporting 2 entities. And he goes, like, why don't we support a town development fund? It's a public entity. So he came to him and said, like, why didn't we support that institution? Why didn't we select that institution for this process? So it helps to kind of, what I'm trying to say is it helps for the NDA to kind of engage them in this international stakeholders engagement process and not just limit them in the country, kind of give them trainings on how you kind of do things. For my understanding, from my implementation over the past 2 years, is that they are aware of it, but they just need sort of guidance on, and these kind of international events or consultations kind of add value to kind of move them to the direction that we want. So in terms of challenge and lesson learned, for me, number one would be the knowledge gap component. So in terms of knowledge gap, so when I started the institutional capacity work itself, we had a very shortage of individuals that we wanted to hire for this intervention. Like let alone the NDA. The NDA, the knowledge of NDA in terms of climate finance was very. I mean, it was not. I wouldn't say it was not there, but it was within a few certain individuals. So the knowledge gap kind of had a major kind of was a major challenge. But I think what we have been able to do is once we identified the structure that we want to implement, we identified the role of each of these units, then we were able to kind of develop trainings specific to those entities. For instance, Climate Finance Unit, you had the technical training on GCF processes. For the technical Climate Finance Technical Unit, Climate Finance Technical Committee, you have the process of evaluation, proposal evaluation. So it has to be specific to those entities that you want to engage in. For NDA, it is more about international events, giving them exposure to institutions that are been doing this for a long time. Similarly, if you look at, there's also a challenge of, when we started, as I mentioned earlier, when we initiated the GCF, I think this is when Marco was there, I think he had, I think before I joined, there were a couple of events that had happened on GCF Readiness Sharing Workshop. And the NDA, when I joined, was still not fully into this modality, in this mode. So when we discussed this institute capacity assessment, and then we kind of proposed that, okay, we will have a structure, we need to get this endorsed by the NDA. So once this structure was there, once this structure was endorsed by the NDA, then it was easier for us to move ahead. It was move ahead not meaning that you don't engage the joint secretary in all the processes. You engage them where it's required for him to be engaged. For instance, if it's a decision making on a proposal, it's the Climate Finance Unit that sits together, makes it an agenda, discusses the agenda, discusses whether a proposal by a certain unit, a certain entity is okay or not to move forward with it. And then you take it to the NDA and give them decisions. So it provides, having this structure helps the NDA to make decisions more effectively and kind of efficiently as well, so that they don't take it as an additional burden as such. In terms of, as I mentioned earlier, the formulation process, you had the accreditation and the proposal, which was helpful to kind of, because there are a lot of, so as you are aware, Nepal, there's a lot of political pressure to get proposals endorsed. There's a lot of political pressure to get entities approved. And as GCF is very particular, it says that the NDA kind of has to kind of check this before it forwards the proposal to GCF. So having these structures, having these processes in place kind of eases the NDAs into decision making. It helps them kind of say, okay, this is the process that we adopted. You need to come by this process. If you come accordingly, then it will be easier for us to make a decision and not be swayed by any political pressure or any other pressures that comes by. So it kind of helps the NDA as well. So we're kind of giving them a support mechanism to make their decisions as well. The other challenges we had was engaging stakeholders and making it kind of inclusive. In terms of stakeholder, as I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of consultation that we need to get every stakeholders involved in this entire readiness intervention. And from our end, we made sure that we kind of engage all the stakeholders. And so by the end of the project timeline, what we have done is, if you look at the project technical committee structure, we have highlighted that there needs to be a representation of independent indigenous groups, indigenous people. There needs to be a representation of women. There needs to be a representation of socially excluded groups as well. So we made sure that these groups are included. We've also been able to kind of identify the various stakeholders. For instance, how do we engage the academia? What would be their role in this process? So we've been able to kind of map out those roles, and that's been highlighted in the handbook as well. As I mentioned earlier, the government turnovers and transitions was a challenge. If you look at right now, the contact point for the NDA has changed for the third time. So every time it changes, there is a stark decline in how receptive they are, how responsive they are to the GCF request and our intervention as well. And as long as there's a structure in place, we have this guidance document, there's a mechanism that kind of supports our interventions or even supports the GCF's mechanisms. I think it helps to kind of ease the transition. It doesn't go away, and there's a kind of institutional memory that sticks along. So in the long run, we have been able to do this. We have been able to have this structure institutionalized. We have been able to have these structures in place where they kind of support the NDA. And even though there's a transition, it is automatically taken over by them. And this is not something additional. We've not done, it is basically a mechanism that's driven by them, by the NDA. And it's not driven by the readiness program. It's driven by, governed by them, it's driven by them. And I think in the end, I think Arabi raised the point, who is the NDA for the country? I think this significantly matters a lot when you're doing readiness, or when we're doing GCF itself. Like if It's a very similar case with what Nepal and Ghana. Nepal, basically, the Ministry of Environment, now the Ministry of Forest and Environment, here's the UNFCCC focal point. And so they have a very strong argument of the climate change matters. They are the focal point for Adaptation Fund as well. So even though they want it to be an NDA, they don't have that equal standing as the Ministry of Finance. So whenever we did an intervention, when the Ministry of Finance requested invitation of participation or engagement, we had a very strong response from all the stakeholders, including when we were doing when you're doing a kind of knowledge sharing event. So it matters that the NDA is an institution that has a hierarchy within all the government institutions, and that kind of eases the processes a long way. But having a portfolio like the Ministry of Finance does not help in terms of some of the interventions that we're trying to do because of this schedule. It's very hard to kind of get them involved in much of the, for instance, it's very hard to get the Joint Secretary involved in all the engagements that we have done. So some of the engagements, he has delegated authority to the head of climate change unit who looks after these interventions, and we're kind of able to manage it. So, and based on, I think, I'm not making the argument based on my learning as well. I think when we did a training in Bangkok through AIT, we had a NDA from Thailand who had come for the presentation, and she also mentioned that I think the challenge with what they're facing right now is the authority that even though they are the NDA, they don't have an authority with other ministries, as the Ministry of Finance does. So this is something that came out of the meeting, and that's how kind of I think that's been resonated with the NDA, and the NDA kind of understands their role at the moment. They understand what they're expected. Even though with the engagement GCF, we've been a little behind because of the transitions. But I think overall, on the long run, I think they are the very well-suited organizations, and building their institutional capacity, having a structure in place kind of helps them to do this work that they're required by the Green Climate Fund. So from my side, I think this is it. If you have questions, I think we have a panel. Thank you.